Thank you so much, Gustavo. And congratulations to both Grace and Gustavo as our new DSA, New York City DSA co-chairs. I know that we as a city are incredibly excited for your leadership as we really kind of embark on this, on what is going to be a very challenging time, but also a very ripe time for organizing some of the most affected people under what is going to be and what is an incoming fascist administration. And as we've said, that is going to be an incredibly challenging time in what is being promised, and the outcome of this election stands to threaten so many communities. But it is also an opportunity for us to really come together in really embark on a new chapter of what should be not just an American left, but American movement, mass movement of the working class. And New York City DSA is an incredibly important piece of that. And to that end, I want to make sure that I welcome all of the hundreds of people that are joining us here today on this call. And many of you are new DSA members. Perhaps some of you are checking out or learning about DSA for the first time. And one of my hopes, and I know one of our larger hopes, is that whether it's DSA or anywhere else, that right now, I believe that one of the most important things that we can do is really, really dig our heels and find a political home. I know that New York City DSA is such a, as Gustavo mentioned, is a really profound and important political home for a lot of different people, and speaks to an ability to take our own power back and organize positively and affirmatively, whether it is for the defense of our immigrant neighbors, whether it is organizing workplaces in union drives and campaigns, whether it is the Build Public Renewables Act, or whether it's fighting and creating organizing tenants unions and fighting for housing laws that more effectively protect tenants' rights and help people afford housing for the first time for a lot of people. So I'm incredibly excited, and we just want to welcome everyone to this call. And we hope that this is, if this is a new day for you, if this is a new time joining into a DSA call, this is a first step into a longer organizing journey and political home as we really, pursue a movement that we hope to be engaged in for the rest of our lives. So I'm incredibly excited to be a part of that with you all here today. And I also want to talk about the power of what is possible, not just on a local level or a state level, but yes, also on the federal level. We are up against a profound and an incredibly powerful political establishment. One that dominates and, of course, is most obviously represented in the horrific aims of a Republican administration, but also a political establishment that has long really commanded a tremendous amount of influence in the Democratic Party. But times are changing, and these are sites of real political struggles in which an ascendant and organized working class can and will gain power. And when we are focused on the affirmative visions and ends and goals that we have, we will be able to meet them. And I have an enormous amount of faith in that. And that's why I know I do this work, and I know that that's why many of you are engaged and are doing this work today. And so I want to talk about a little bit about what's possible. As Gustavo mentioned several years ago, when we first introduced the Green New Deal resolution, it was just resoundingly mocked by the Democratic establishment. Even at that time, then Speaker Pelosi called it the Green Dream. People said it was impossible. People said that it was a laughingstock. But if we fast forward to just several months ago, we were able to pressure President Biden into signing an executive order that authorized one of the first steps of the Green New Deal, which is a 20,000 member civilian climate corps. And we now are employing people across all 50 states in or rather employing people across the entire country and employing them in everything from installing solar panels on community centers and community health clinics to employing recent college graduates in restoring our federal lands and repopulating mangrove trees everywhere from places like Puerto Rico to the Midwest United States, and really beginning to invest and create an economy that also has opportunities to join a unionized workforce in order to reorganize our economy and essentially have a World War II level federal investment on combating the climate crisis, is what we are starting to accomplish already materially. It is happening. It is in the ground, and it is happening precisely because of the support of communities and organizations like New York City-DSA. It wouldn't have happened without this kind of organizing. And that's just one of the many victories that we've had thus far. We've also introduced this year the Homes Act, in which we bust down hundreds of housing activists, including DSA members, to Washington, D.C. to unveil historic housing legislation that would expand and give HUD the authority to essentially create a public bank to invest in and build thousands of new housing units across the United States, if not over more than 1 million new housing units across the United States, including public housing and, importantly, social housing models, in order to build a housing stock that is outside of the private market and incapable of being captured by private equity interests. These are the kinds of things that are possible. And it's not just that we introduced this legislation, but we are building real power behind it. The Green New Deal itself, as a resolution, now has over 100 co-sponsors in the Democratic Party, many of whom do not even identify with the Progressive Caucus or other more left-affiliated caucuses, and that is because of the political power and constituency that we are building, not just in New York City, but across the country. The Homes Act itself has been rolled out with a co-sponsor, and we introduced the Green New Deal for public housing with, of course, Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Ed Markey. When we introduced the Homes Act this year, we introduced that with Minnesota Senator Tina Smith, which also really indicates and demonstrates the expanding power and growing power and influence that really the landscape of ideas that we are winning and fighting back against a neoliberal default of market-based solutions, where the alternative is essentially to give Wall Street more and more money, and that will somehow solve our problems. So we are truly and genuinely winning and gaining real territory in a battle of ideas in the Democratic Party, but importantly, nationally, including with the Republican Party as well. We've also passed geothermal permitting reform through the Republican-led House of Representatives. And that also just goes to demonstrate the amount of influence that we're starting to gain both in Republican circles as well, which is also evidenced by being what I like to call caught fighting. When we are caught fighting for people with legislation like the Defiance Act that I introduced earlier this year, which really allowed and put guardrails around AI companies and AI technology, from taking or lifting one photo of an individual and being able to generate non-consensual pornographic material, making sure that we not only build those coalitions, but also make an affirmative and accessible vision where people who ascribe to a democratically socialist worldview are caught fighting for the betterment of all people, which is basically what we believe in and what we do. Then we make our ideas more popular by showing what our ideas are all about. And so the how of what we do things and the how of what we organize really helps us in the what, in terms of what we're fighting for. And so I'm incredibly excited to be on this call with you all today. And it is very important, however, as well, for us to really assess what the current state of the left is right now. Of course, given the unfolding and ongoing genocide in Gaza, this has been an extraordinarily challenging year for the world, for a human rights movement, and for a broader left. APAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee, which is known for having extraordinarily large influence in Congress, and has also, of course, famously chosen to endorse an overwhelming amount of insurrectionists in Congress and Republicans in Congress, pledged at the top of this year a $100 million effort to unseat and target virtually any member of Congress that seriously challenges their power. And they not just floated that threat generally for the entire Democratic caucus, most specifically, but they will toss some ads against Republicans here and there as well, such as Representative Thomas Massie. But at the top of this year, AIPAC promised not just to dump that money against Democrats more broadly, but they also targeted their threat quite specifically at a group of us in Congress, notably almost all members of color, almost all progressive, and many of us young and ascendant in the House caucus. And so that was absolutely an effort that went underway. And even for races in which you did not see an explicit primary play out, it is important that we know that there were pretty much active recruitment efforts occurring in almost every single one of these districts. And we had to organize and fight for our lives. Every single one of us has, and rather fight for our political lives and our careers, given that. And many of us survived. It is important and it is notable. Newly elected representatives such as Summer Lee out in Pennsylvania were able to survive an initial AIPAC kind of float and challenge. But we are not out of the woods. We are never out of the woods when it comes to that. And we must continue to organize and expand a political movement for human rights, and especially for the human rights of Palestinians, for whom they have very little political defense in the United States. There is no such type of committee, as we all know, that is willing to or able to offer those kinds of resources. It's just AIPAC. And so making sure that we do that. But we've also been able to mobilize a huge amount of resources. But it has been a very challenging year, especially with the losses of fantastic representatives like Representative Jamal Bowman from Congress and Representative Cori Bush. But we do know that despite the fact that they are not going to be serving another term in Congress, they are also not walking away from movement organizing either. And we very much look forward to continuing that fight. But in terms of where we go from here, we know that on day one of the Trump presidency, we must make sure that we organize to protect our immigrant neighbors for whom they have already pledged that on day one of this administration, they will be targeting for mass deportations. That represents 1 in every 15 families in the United States. And that number is much higher when we look at places like New York City, as well as our LGBT and especially our trans siblings here, for whom they have been scapegoated and targeted by both political parties, the Republican Party in terms of their campaigning, and also in many of the kind of reactionary or conservative elements of the Democratic Party, which sought to reflexively point out and blame or highlight trans Americans as a reason for the Democratic Party's loss in the election. And so given that environment, it is extremely important that we continue to organize for them and for DSA's core issue campaigns. And so with that, I hand it over.
Thank you so much. So we're going to have a few questions from our members, 3 questions, and I want to introduce the first member who's going to ask a question. Jihan Tekelu is an electoral leader and a labor leader in our organization. She lives in the Bronx, and I'll pass it over to Jihan.
Hi, thank you for taking our questions. You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Jihan. Thank you.
All right. I'm also a public sector union member. In addition to those things, I want to ask you about your perspective on the complicated task of undoing US imperialism, from the ever-expanding military budget to the broad influence of the APAC lobby, which you mentioned, and increasing restrictions on free speech and everyday life, from workers to students, to the deadly presence of US weapons in Palestine, Lebanon, and around the world. With the Trump presidency and a Republican control of the House and Senate, what are some of the short and long-term pathways you see for organizing to end US support for genocide and support for Palestinian liberation? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jihan, for your question. I think it's especially given the Republican trifecta, we are going to be encountering incredibly difficult headwinds. And given that, I think that our mobilization with organizations is going to become even more important. Over the last year, many of the actions and protest actions and organizing around protest actions have developed a strong muscle around that. And now I believe it is time that we organize in addition to an infrastructure on top of that. And so whether that is even especially locally or municipally, as you mentioned, there are very serious free speech and attacks and infringements on free speech. I don't think even on a federal level, this is about resisting it just federally, but also in terms of New York State, especially, there are consistently proposals that are put in to boycott nonprofit organizations or boycott or for the state to boycott organizations or not contract with organizations that have indicated objections to the human rights abuses that are happening in the West Bank or in Gaza. And so making sure that we resist even under Democratic administration, some of these encroachments on free speech, in which broad-based organizations such as the ACLU have also voiced very strong opposition to. And so not just, and we have those legislative pathways, and it's also important that we build the civil liberties and the civil rights pathways in organizing in streets as well. Additionally, I think it's important as well to note some of the progress that we have made federally this year. Earlier this year, I led a whip operation to organize a record high number of no votes on the Israel supplemental vote in order to withhold offensive weaponry on human rights conditions from the Israeli government. And we must make sure that we reintroduce and discuss the same and applying the same standards here that the United States applies to any one of their other allies. And so that, I think, is a tremendously important work that we must continue to build on. We reached a kind of a high watermark with about 37 no votes among the Democratic caucus, in addition to another 21 no votes on the Republican caucus. And those no votes were not just the left of the left. They include the Homeland Security Chairman, Benny Thompson. They included the Oversight Committee Chairman, Jamie Raskin, and making sure that we not only deepen our commitments within our movement, but also broaden them as a wider coalition of everyday people who may not associate themselves or identify themselves ideologically, but they do identify themselves morally with what they see as just an absolute horror, watching children and innocent people be targeted in this way continuously for over a year straight.
Thank you so much. Our next question is going to be asked by a Queens DSA leader, Diana Moreno, who was formerly on our steering committee. Diana, is she around? Can we
Yep, I'm right here. Hi,
Hi.
Congresswoman.
How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm enjoying parental leave, which is one of the best things that we need to strengthen and expand in New York State and elsewhere. So I have a question about how we what DSA is enjoying right now, which is a great increase in our interest, and that is something that you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction. You said on your recent election debrief on Instagram, I didn't want to be in a place where on November 6th, we were preparing to resist a fascist regime. Unfortunately, that's where we are. I wanted to be fighting the corporate establishment of the Democratic Party instead. So many people joining DSA right now are actually naming the disillusionment with the Democratic Party as their motivation to join DSA. Here in New York City, as you know, Trump gained 95,000 votes, while Harris lost 500,000 votes compared to Biden in 2020. One piece of evidence pointing to the broad dissatisfaction and disillusionment with the Democratic Party. So our question to you is, what comes next? How should we respond to the Democratic Party establishment and orient towards the needs of the working class?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Diana, and congratulations as well for your little reason why you're on parental leave. And it's it just underscores again how important what it is we're fighting for and why we're fighting. In terms of your question, I think that one of the things that we have that much of the rest of kind of the more establishment parts of the Democratic Party doesn't have is a real mobilization, especially in places like New York City, of a real ability to mass mobilize and connect, particularly with disaffected people and people who are most marginalized and most, frankly, under the boot of the economic precarity that we're living in right now. We also have a lot of things that are working for us that are important for us to learn from. In terms of New York City, as you mentioned, there were enormous amounts of areas that swung in Trump's direction. Even if they didn't vote in the majority for Trump, they trended towards him. One of the exceptions, though, is in our congressional district right here of New York 14, where we saw a very interesting phenomenon where at the top of the ticket, there was a general trend towards Donald Trump and erosion. But, and I don't say this to toot our own horn on the congressional level, but however, at the congressional level, we actually outperformed the top of the ticket. In terms of my candidacy, I was able to outperform the top of the ticket, Vice President Harris, not just in terms of vote share and percentage, but in raw votes. And what we can do is learn from areas where we are able to do that. And one of the things that we've learned is direct contact, organizing, and speaking directly and unapologetically to people's economic and also just material needs is incredibly and deeply important. Also, when we are everywhere, when people trust us because they see us in places. And when I think about one of the reasons why I first joined DSA, it wasn't because I grew up in a leftist household. It's because I grew up scrubbing toilets with my mom. And whenever I went to an immigrant rights rally or I was organizing around Rikers or organizing around education, I consistently saw DSA members there. And so it's, to me, when people see us fighting for them materially, physically, they will trend towards us. And it should not be lost on any one of us that Donald Trump was here in New York City a lot. He was in barbershops in the Bronx. He was hosting consistent rallies. He had multiple rallies in my congressional district. Of course, he had that horrific rally at Madison Square Garden, but it was not the only one. And so the presence that we have being in the streets, not just in the form of protest, but in the form of aid, of organizing, of community, and creating spaces and communities of people that people want to be a part of, that feel good and constructive and safe and visionary, is an incredibly important part of our theory of change. And so when it comes to the relationship with the Democratic Party, my my theory has always been that where necessary, yes, we must have and confront stark differences, but we're not going to gain power through confrontation alone. We gain power through getting bigger then, and getting bigger than the alternative, being more compelling than the alternative. And we are doing that, whether it's upgrading or updating and renewing the Fight for 15, whether it is doubling down and expanding and better articulating our demands on Medicare for all. These are the kinds of demands that are going to help us win, and these are the demands that are going to help us grow as well.
We're about to go to our last question, but we have a quick poll that we want to put up for the participants. Please just fill out the poll when you see it, and we'll share the results in a couple of minutes. While you're filling out the poll, we're going to go to Jay Zacharias, who is also a Queen's DSA member. I think every speaker who have asked the 3 questions are constituents of yours. I'm not totally sure. That was totally a coin.
Amazing.
So let's go to Jay.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for being here. Yeah. So my question is the following. So it's quite crazy to say, but it's been about 6 years since you were elected to Congress. You're one of the most well-known and popular political figures in the United States. I'm myself am a part of the membership committee for NYC-DSA via the Labor Working Group. And so my question relies around, particularly around onboarding. And so my question is around, for people who are considering joining our organization, and you already touched on this with Deanna's question, but could you share why you joined DSA, why you've decided to remain a member, and why should others consider joining right now? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jay. Really appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I started talking about it a little bit, but I want to dive into, I think, my story a little bit, more deeply. But my family's originally from the Bronx. One of the reasons why, when I was younger, my family had to move from the Bronx when I was, at a younger age, because the dropout rates were over 50% in the Bronx than where I was at. And my parents felt like there was just no way I was going to have a shot in public school or a fair shot. And so we had kind of moved around, and I went to college. And by the time I was in college, I had, my goddaughter was born, and I moved back to the Bronx because I didn't want her to live through what I had lived through. I wanted her to be able to go to school and be raised and have the confidence of being in her community and not having her family to have to make that choice. And so I moved back, and I did a lot of community organizing, and I was involved in educational organizing that eventually led to organizing to help families people and kids whose parents were locked up in Rikers. And I got involved in criminal justice activism. Of course, when the hurricane hit in Puerto Rico, a lot of the post-Maria organizing and activism was going on, and I was involved in that. And I kept seeing that in each one of these places, there were DSA members that showed up. And for so many of us, these were fights that were happening almost in relative obscurity back then at the time. This was before, this was before the uprisings in 2020 for criminal justice reform. This was before all of these things. And these were a lot of communities and activists that were kind of just organizing almost in the shadows, and they weren't attracting a ton of people at this time. And then all of a sudden, we would see DSA members showing up to affirmatively and support so many different movements. And so that's when DSA was first really, really kind of put on my radar from a place of okay, respect. But what got me through the door at DSA was a kind of an immigration and economic rights organizer that I knew, a friend of mine, invited me. And before I knew it, I was in the basement of a church in Harlem. I was at Bum Branch, was the first meeting I ever went to. And there were, they had brought in immigrant workers who were working at the warehouses for the B&H photo at the time, talking about the really unsafe work conditions that were going on. And there was a picket line going on, and there was childcare at the meeting. And I was like, okay, this is real deal organizing. This is like community. Like, a lot of people talk about it, but they aren't always being about it. And this was a community of people who were being about it. And they were compassionate with each other, and they would debate things. And yeah, sometimes it got like hot or heated in the debates, because that's what being part of the left is. But they were, like, this was a place where we were actually committed to being in this space and struggle with each other and materially improving people's lives. And the how in which we did it, and we were humane with each other, and we understood the difference between good faith disagreements and bad faith ones, but we understood that our solidarity with each other is a real commitment. That solidarity is not just I stand with someone when I agree with them, but solidarity is we stand with each other when we disagree with each other, because we understand the bigger forces at play that we are up against. And it felt like such a constructive and positive place to be, where if you wanted to help and you didn't know how, you can show up and say, you know what, I'm going to go to this picket line. I'm going to deep canvas on that issue. I'm going to do childcare for one of the meetings. I'm going to try to set up one of the socials for this community to help people connect with one another. And it is such a great place that's almost like a directory for social movements and political fights in order to build power for everyday people. And at the end of the day, these are people, and this is a community of people who are united in a vision to guarantee health care to every single American, to make sure everyone is paid a living wage as a matter of right, to make sure that we all have access to housing, and that we stand up and organize against the power of people who are trying to extort extort ourselves and our incomes in order to squeeze every dime out in rent, and to make sure that people can actually fight back and have a livable life in the 21st century. And we know that we have to do that because we frankly have no other choice. The alternative is not sustainable. And so to me, it is such a life-affirming decision to make, to dedicate our lives to each other. And I can't think of any other better thing to do with our time, to be honest. And we have an obligation not just to win, but to have fun and to really care for each other and make a community with one another.
Thank you. That was so inspiring. I love that. And I think speaks to a big reason that we're like asking people here to join DSA. It seems like a lot of you are on the fence, maybe wanting to learn more, and we're going to talk about that more. But to build on what the Congresswoman was saying, like I feel like all the skills I have are skills that I was like gifted by comrades who have been just so generous with their time. And like, you can say, I want to help build this campaign. I want to understand how Albany works. I want to start understanding how Washington works. Who are the players? How can I get engaged? Where should I put pressure? And people want to share that information. If we don't know, we try to learn together. And what's so great I found about New York City DSA and DSA generally is just trying to take down those barriers that a lot of like the consulting class, the lobbyist class really try to keep up to like make it seem like what they do is unknowable and so special, but really it's something that we all can do, and that you can do, and I really hope you do. And DSA is a great place to get those skills. I really hope you join. I'm vamping a little bit because we're creating some time for you to join now to click that link. It really only takes a few minutes. Do start at $5 a month. We ask if you can afford more, please do, you know, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. We try to scale those things so that we can fund our project independently and without relying on donors and big funds like that, and to really operate independently. But I hope many dozens, hundreds of the people on this call join. It really is empowering. It's a great way to learn how to do a wide variety of politics. And there's thousands of people in this organization, including the Congresswoman herself, who want to like share information to empower people to show that it's like not all a black box, that it is something we can change and have an influence on. So I'll end my pitch there and pass it back to the Congresswoman to introduce our next piece of the agenda.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Grace. And yeah, you know, I think I absolutely encourage people to check out a meeting. If you want to, just come. And it's a really powerful place to be. And I think that wherever you can be in community, that is generally one of the most important priorities that we just have right now in this moment as we prepare and you know, start to try to prepare ourselves for the onslaught that will be the Trump administration. My number one thing that I think is important that people do is to find and join community, especially after COVID, especially after the isolation that so many people have felt for so long. The antidote to that is doing sometimes the hard thing if we are in the habit of isolating, which is a lot of us. But isolation is where fascism breeds. Isolation is where fascism blooms and grows. And community is where it can be dismantled. And community is also where we can improve our own lives and flourish as human beings. And so I really, really encourage everyone to find community in this time and to use this time to really deepen those bonds. We're going to need each other in the next 4 years. And it's really important that we do that. So I encourage everyone, please, 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 you are about to hear from the Assemblywoman, Marcela Mitañez, and as well as our Amazon and Starbucks organizers that have been leading absolutely historic worker drives. This is the stuff that is changing this country. Truly. I first met with one of the first Starbucks organizing chapters out in Buffalo while we were also supporting the India Walton mayoral campaign. They became the first Starbucks in the country to unionize, and now Starbucks workers are unionizing in New York City and beyond. Please make sure that you stay on and hear from Marcela, who is an absolutely badass fellow DSA in office member at the state level. And Marcela really highlights how this strategy of electing at the city, state, and federal level all stitches together and is part of a larger movement. And our Amazon and Starbucks organizers really demonstrate how we can do this in our workplaces. And there are plenty and plenty other issue campaigns as well. So please make sure you stay on, hear about some of the work that's going on. And I hope to see you in person at a meeting soon. Bye-bye.